This is Nebraska Farmcast from the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Ryan Evans. There are a number of scenarios in which the ownership and liability for center pivots can be divided between landowners and tenants, which can create complications for both parties. However, different scenarios often call for adjusting rental payments when tenants own all or part of the pivot. And regardless of how ownership is divided, one thing is certain, that the landowner and tenant need to put the arrangement in writing as part of the lease. For more on different situations that can impact rental payments, I'm here with Jessica Groskopf, an extension ag economist with the Center for Ag Profitability. She's based out of Scottsbluff and has co-authored a new article on our site about this issue. And Jessica, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So what is the traditional ownership scenario for center pivots on rented crop ground, and why is that a common way to do things, do you think?
Yeah, so when we look at center pivot irrigated ground, traditionally the landowner owns that equipment. Because it's a long-term investment on the property, that's how it's typically done. However, we know that there are times when maybe that landowner is not ready to make that investment, or the tenant wants some upgrades. So there might be some scenarios where that ownership is split.
Yeah, and can you walk through some of those situations that might call for a break from this traditional division, and then what those arrangements might mean for each party?
Typically, we see there are three scenarios when we see split ownership. And again, this either arises from the landowner not wanting to make that large of an investment, or the tenant really encouraging it and being willing to pay for a portion of that long-term investment. So those three scenarios are the transition from dry land to irrigated cropland, the transition from gravity irrigated ground to center pivot irrigated ground, or the replacement of an outdated or aged center pivot system. So when we look at those three scenarios, it's really important that each party think about what pieces and parts of that center pivot irrigation system they're going to own. And what's most common based on Nebraska Extension's interaction with these landlords and tenants who have divided ownership is that the landlord will own everything underground. So all of the underground fixtures of that center pivot system, including the pump, underground utilities, pipe, and then pays for all the dirt work required for that installation. Then the tenant will own everything above ground. And what this does is it allows for that center pivot to be removed at potentially some point in the future. So again, the landowner is going to own the permanent underground fixtures, and the tenant then is going to own the above ground fixtures. So it's really something that we have to consider as we're putting in these systems. So as we look at that, then if we look at the repair expenses, the landowner would be responsible for any repairs underground, and the tenant then would be responsible for any repairs above ground.
Great. And how can this division of ownership when it comes to center pivots factor into the cash rent that's charged to the tenant?
So this is really where things get kind of fun, is because now we have transitioned some of those ownership costs to the tenant, right? So that tenant is already then paying more on an annual basis for the upkeep and maintenance of that pivot. They're doing everything for that above ground equipment. And in 2017, Nebraska Extension did a analysis of this in our Nebraska Farm Real Estate Market Development Survey. And what we found is there should be, or there is a discount for that pivot being owned by the tenant. The problem is it's not very clear of what the discount should be. And of course, that's going to differ across the state. What it did show us, though, is that discount places the rent somewhere between the gravity irrigated rental rate and the center pivot irrigated rental rate for the area. So the reality is, if you're in a situation or you're entering a situation where you're going to divide the ownership of a pivot, you're going to have to negotiate what that rental rate is, because you're not going to receive, more than likely, the full center pivot rate that's being offered in your area. It's going to have to be decreased because that tenant is taking on those additional expenses.
And what kinds of things should be in the lease then related to center pivots to protect both parties? What are your recommendations?
So beyond what the rental rate is, then we have to deal with the pivot itself. So what happens if the tenant is terminated? Because now they own that fixture. So there are really three things that should be looked at. Number one, will the landowner have the option to purchase the center pivot equipment, or will they be required to purchase it at the time of termination of the tenant? If they're allowed to purchase the equipment, what is the purchase price and how will that be determined? And finally, if the tenant must remove the equipment, how soon must that be done from the date of termination? So those are the three things that we really have to look at when we're looking at a lease agreement, is really thinking about if that tenant walks away, what happens to that above ground equipment?
All right, great information from Jessica Groskopf, an Extension Ag economist with the Center for Ag Profitability. Again, look for the new article that she has co-authored on our website at cap.unl.edu to read more about adjusting rental payments when tenants own the center pivot. Jessica, thank you as always for the great information.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.